I like to just sit there. I sit there and I think about questions and then I answer them in my head. I like that it all happens in my head. When I'm trying to remember something, I don't want to be reaching outside of myself. I need an app. I need something to help me remember. Or I need to write down things. I have to write. If I don't have paper and a pencil, I'm helpless. I understand that those are valuable. But personally speaking, I like it to all be inside of my head. What is the way that you best remember things? If you ask yourself that question first, you'll come up with some ideas that might help you to focus your energy a little bit. Because if you're doing something that doesn't fit with how you think, then you're kind of constantly working uphill. It's a battle. Whereas if you're doing stuff that fits with how you think, then it's going to be like coasting downhill. It will still be work, but at least the effort that you put in will pay off more, right? So how do you best remember things? Some people like to use spaced repetition, like Anki, for example. I've talked about that before, but this is where you have a piece of information to remember. You then put it in a flashcard app. You can make your own flashcards, but I would recommend putting it in a flashcard app like Anki, and then doing that again and again until it sticks eventually. And spaced repetition is showing you that information at the right frequency so that it will stick faster. It's basically based on this thing called the forgetting curve, right? So maybe that's your style. Great, spaced repetition works for you. It's not really my style, okay? There's this method, it's got a name I can't quite remember, but there's one where you have to write down things on cue cards and put them in a file drawer, and it's also really complicated, but that works for some people. Taking a lot of written notes, organizing them extremely well. Part of that is called chunking. Chunking was where you take bits of information and you organize them in really well-organized, well-categorized parts, and then you place them in the right sort of organization system. That could be a file cabinet to help you then find that when you need it, right? And the process of writing things down on the cue cards is also a very important part of the process. That is, the name escapes me right now, but there's a system about that. Okay, I'm going to share my general approach with you, and it's just one, right? So take bits and pieces if they work for you, but if not, that's totally fine. But my sort of approach includes a few different techniques. And so I want to kind of piece them together. And as we go, I want you to kind of think about whether or not the individual techniques would work for you for the things that you need to remember. And if we're talking about English, whether that's grammar or idioms, phrases, vocabulary words, things like that, right? Okay, so when I need to remember something, my project is to have it accessible in my head in a context that is going to be useful for conversations. My personal issue with the flashcard systems or the spaced repetition system, for me, again, it's great, it works, but for me, is that it makes it a little more difficult for me to have insights about that information, right? To pull out new ideas from the information. Makes it harder for me because, maybe I memorize the thing, but I don't have the context, right? It helps me to have a bit more context. The other systems, the more external ones that require a lot of writing and sorting and filing, those things don't really work for me as well because I feel too much of it is outside my head. I want it to be in my head. I want it to be accessible. And I want it to be accessible in a way that has a context so that when I access it, I can do something with it, right? And again, it includes a few different things So let's go through it, all right? Now, the first piece of this I think is really important, and this is summarizing. In your own words, very important. Not that the summary has to be great, but summarizing in some way is very important, okay? Now, this is also useful for the flashcard systems and also potentially useful for some of the other systems as well, because you're writing things down. But I call it summarizing because that's what it is. I'm saying basically, what is this thing that I just read? Or this thing that I just heard? Could be heard, could be read. It works for both. That's also why I like it. The reason that it's so important is that you're immediately using the information to make something. What are you making? You're making a summary. Now, should this be written or spoken? I like to do a spoken summary. That's what works for me, a spoken summary. I like to speak what I think I understand about for example, what I read. I often use this for stuff that I read. I read a lot, and when I read something, I like to summarize it, usually by speaking, and that really helps it stick because you're interacting with it. And you're also checking that you actually understand it. You're kind of forcing yourself to really understand what you just read, and you're doing something with it so it sort of sticks a little bit more, right? So here is a short excerpt from Plato's Republic, okay? Let's say this is what we're reading. I just gave you a short one, but we could be talking about a much longer piece, okay? The society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of states, or indeed, my dear Glaucon, of humanity itself, till philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers, and political power and philosophy thus come into the same hands. Okay, what we have here is a specific idea, and I consider this idea as the sort of core of this piece, this excerpt. Now, maybe I'm talking about something longer, but whatever. So what I do is, number one, make sure I have the basic core, the concept in my mind. What is this really about? Okay? Then I'm going to take that core concept, I'm going to kind of forget about the words that Plato uses to say this, and I'm going to say it as I would if I were writing it. Maybe a little simpler, though. Maybe not as complex, maybe not every idea, but just the basic core. How would I say that to someone who has never heard this before? Now, there's another technique. I believe it's called the Feynman technique or something like that, where you have to understand something so that you could explain it to, I think it's a 10 or a 12-year-old. And that's called, I think it's the Feynman technique or the Feynman method or something like that. You have to simplify it until you understand it well enough to explain it pretty simply to someone else, okay? So, how would I do that? Plato believes that the problems in society that governments have could be solved if the people who were in charge, the people with political power, were also philosophers. And if I had kept reading, or read a little bit before, I would have known that these are called philosopher kings. Okay. Now, philosopher king, that's something you can hold on to. That's an image. The core concept is actually philosopher king. And then I've made a summary about that core concept. Core concept, philosopher king. Summary, what I just said. That's a basic summary. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's just me trying to sort of talking through my understanding, right? Because that's basically what he's saying here. So now if I wanted to create an image and remember this, I might imagine a philosopher whose face I know. Maybe I know Socrates, a lot of paintings of Socrates, the one right before his death, famous painting, and I could imagine a crown on his head. And imagining that philosopher king will then help me to unlock the whole thing, the summary I made, and this idea, and to remember what Plato is saying in the Republic about the problems of states, governments, and their rulers. I could say it another way. The problem of governments or states is that their rulers are selfish, greedy, corrupt. He's not saying that exactly, but that's, my understanding. And foolish. Philosophers are generally more wise, more rational. They use reason to solve problems, and they tend to be less greedy. If the philosophers and the kings could be merged together into one giant robot philosopher king, the problems of government would be solved. Now, that's not my opinion. That's me summarizing Plato's opinion about the problem of states. Okay, so that's the idea, right? That's the basic idea. All right, now we've done the summary stage. That's a key part because that's you interacting with your knowledge, and it's kind of forcing you to understand it. It's forcing you to work with it, and it's forcing you to immediately create something. And that act of creating, doing something with what you learn, is active, whereas just reading it is passive. Passive is stored in short-term memory, so you think you know it when you read it, got it. But short-term memory fades after a few hours or sometimes days. And so if you don't do something to store it in long-term memory, then it's going to fade forever. You're not going to remember, what did he say about what was the thing with I forget. But you summarize, you've done something with it. Now, I like to then ask myself a few questions. Now, there's a version of this called active recall, and active recall allows you to essentially interact with what you're learning by thinking about questions and by participating as though what you were reading were another person telling you that. Hold on, wait a second, I have a question, right? But then you answer the question. So you're kind of playing both parts. Think of it like that. Whatever you're learning, whatever you've read, whatever you're trying to remember, how can you interact with it? Not just summarize it, not just make something with it, but interact with it. Right? If someone just puts a thing on the table, a piece of clay, it looks like a ball, and you just look at it, you don't know that much about it. Okay, it's red and it's a ball. But if you pick it up and you feel it and you play with it and you stretch it out and you do things with it, you know more about it. And the experience of doing that is going to give you a deeper understanding of it. And the experience of doing something with it will make it stick in your mind. Again, there's a variation of this called active recall, and it's a specific process. But I like to just think of it as it's questions. Ask yourself some questions about it. That's it. If you ask yourself a few questions and answer those questions, at least it's going to stick better. And at most, it's going to stick and you're going to have a deeper understanding of it. Okay, so what kind of rulers does Plato think can make a better society? Okay, well, Plato thinks that if the people who were the rulers or the kings had a way of thinking that was philosophical or philosophical training, they would be better at being kings. Or maybe if the philosophers decided to become kings and they were the rulers, then the society would be better as well. That's his idea. Okay, that's the answer to the question. Why does Plato think that kings should be philosophers? A philosopher in Plato's mind is someone who uses reason, who questions things, who is balanced, who is fair-minded, who has a lot of positive attributes that allow them to think rationally through problems, and that makes them less likely to be corrupted, less likely to just be wanting to conquer other territories for greed and power and things like that. They would be more fair and have better judgment. That's why he thinks they would be, the kings would be better served to learn philosophy, or better if philosophers were to become kings, or there were a philosopher king, Socrates with the crown, right? Why are states so troubled? Now there I would want to maybe go into, there I maybe need more context. I would want to have read the whole thing. Now I want to be clear, you don't have to just do this with a paragraph. You can do this with a whole chapter. I usually do it with chapters. I think paragraphs, it's too much of a pain for me to do this with every paragraph. I usually take a large section or a whole chapter and then summarize that, ask myself a few questions. And by the way, you can do this written, but I don't. I like to just sit there. I sit there and I think about questions and then I answer them in my head. I like that it all happens in my head. When I'm trying to remember something, I don't want to be reaching outside of myself. I need an app. I need something to help me remember. Or I need to write down things. I have to write. If I don't have paper and a pencil, I'm helpless. I understand that those are valuable. But personally speaking, I like it to all be inside of my head. Maybe that's neurotic, but that's just me. I like it to all live inside my head. So I do often do the summaries, actually speaking the summaries. And I sometimes use a speech-to-text app with an Apple Watch, and I will speak, blah, 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 blah. I will speak my summary, and when I get home, because that Apple Watch app is connected to my phone and that's connected to my computer, I can open it up on my computer when I get home, and I can see what I said outside on my walk when I get home. There's my summary, and I can save it or edit it or review it, right? So I'll do that sometimes. Then I'll ask myself some mental questions and answer those. Then, okay, so I've made something with it. I've interacted with it, and now I want to make a few things specifically stick. Now, let's say the philosopher king. I said there's one image there. What I want to do is I want to remember that Plato said the best kind of rulers are the ones who use philosophy. Those would be the best kings, okay? So I pictured that there's a famous painting of Socrates, one of the most famous philosophers, right? And I'm picturing him sitting there, laying there on the table, sort of reclined, talking to all his pals. And he's got a big crown on his head, and it's a shining crown, right? Now, I imagine, if I want to, okay, I imagine that Socrates, with the crown, is sitting behind the big desk with the curtains in the White House. Okay? So there I have created a complex image that is hard to forget. I've got a philosopher. He's wearing his robes, right? The classic sort of Greek get-up. He's wearing a big golden crown, it's shining, and he's sitting behind the desk in the White House. That image, I've made an association or associations with my imagination, and because it's complex, it's not simple, it's number one, interesting, so it's hard to forget, but it also unlocks the meaning when I see it. Now, we can talk more about placing it in a minute, but that's just an image, okay? Now, visually you can do that. That's sort of your imagination. You create a picture of something that integrates the concepts. So I like to do this a lot. This is part of a whole thing called a memory palace, right? It integrates the concepts. The crown is a symbol for the king. The White House is a reinforcement of ruling, actually ruling, making regulations and laws and things like that. And the person is a philosopher, so he represents reason and all of that stuff. So these simplified images combined together, because usually you don't see a philosopher with a crown, that's a unique image, so it sticks in your memory. And when you recall it, all of the pieces are there, like it's sitting in front of you, and it sort of unlocks itself, and you remember everything. Very cool, right? Now, what if we wanted to remember a name? So for things like names, words, if we have trouble remembering it, we might use a mnemonic. Now, if we go back and we read that dialogue, there's a name here, and maybe we want to remember who specifically Socrates was talking about. My dear Glaucon. Okay, I don't know if it's Glaucon or Glaucon, but okay. Now, maybe that I can't really have a picture there, or maybe I want to create a picture, but I need to use the sound in order to create the picture. All right, so is there anything that when I say Glaucon, is there anything that pops to mind? To me, the first thing that pops to mind is glaucoma. Glaucoma is a vision issue that's related to blood pressure. And so I don't know if this happens with people who have glaucoma, but I know it's got pressure. So when I think of it, I think of bulging eyes. I think that's Graves' disease. But anyway, I think of bulging eyes. So I picture bulging eyes, right? Bulging eyes. And this person who's listening is not understanding. So the bulging eyes represent like a state of what's going on, shock or surprise. So I want to remember maybe that glaucon is somehow confused by all the ideas that are being discussed in Plato's Republic. And so he's like this all the time. Just he's kind of lost, and his eyes are bulging, and I glauc. That reminds me of the name, Glaucon. Now, it might work, it might not work. You have to think about one that works really well. For me, this works very well because I know that this root is also associated with owls and the big eyes of owls. So it works. Glaucon, I think glauc is related to owls, and so there's a mnemonic association that I can make, right? You might do something very creative with it. I was reading recently another dialogue that's part of Plato's complete works called Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is this young guy who wants to prosecute his own father because he believes he knows what justice is. He understands what these things are. He understands his duty, right? So he's having a dialogue with Socrates about virtue and justice and duty. He thinks he knows what's right. So I was on a walk at the time because I happened to be listening to that one on an audiobook, and I was walking, and a car pulled out in front of me and then kept going. But I visualized at that moment, okay, what if a guy had popped out of the car window at that moment to yell at me, and it was a young guy, and what if he had a huge afro, big hair like this, and what if he started yelling at me about duty and justice or virtue? What if he started doing that? Okay, well, why would he do that? Well, because there's a thing I want to remember, which is his name, which is Euthyphro. Youth, afro. So I picture the afro and that he's young, and now I remember the name. And because I remember that he's yelling at me about these things because he thinks he knows what's right, I remember that as well. So I've created this little scene, and that makes the concept stick to the name. So when I recall the name, I can recall the concept. Okay? So that's the basic idea. You could do it with almost any name. You have to be very creative sometimes. So we've talked about how to summarize and why that's important. We've talked about how to ask questions to make what you learned really stick. We've talked about making associations that will, of course, help make things stick, but also give you a way to remember names and words, specific things, right? And concepts associated to those things. And again, you can use this for words as well. So you can use it for anything, right? Anything you need to learn, these basic ideas. Now we might consider placing it. Now let's say we wanted to learn the names of all the Platonic dialogues. Okay, what about for English? Well, let's say you wanted to learn the names of all the parts of speech. Let's say you wanted to learn 500 idioms by the end of the year. Let's say you wanted to learn maybe the key takeaways from from Strunk in White's The Elements of Style. Is that E.B. White? Is that E.B. White? Strunk in White, The Elements of Style. Let's say you want to remember the different tenses, right? Past perfect, present perfect, and present continuous, all of those, right? You can use the same concepts to remember these things, but you might feel then a little confused about where to put them all, right? Like, okay, do I have to are they just these free-floating things in my mind? Once I remember one of them, I've got this great image of the philosopher with the crown and the White House, but what do I do with that, right? Okay, one thing you can do is place them in a coherent place. This is the part that's called the mind palace or the memory palace. So if you have a place that you know very well, maybe that's your local park, maybe that's your childhood home, maybe that's where you went to school, maybe that's your hometown, a whole city, maybe it's this park. I'm looking at a park here. I know this park really well, so what I'm going to do is say, okay, I want to remember all the names of the dialogues. I am going to make little images for all of those and place them in this park in order so that when I walk along a specific path in my memory, you have to be able to visualize really well. When you walk along a specific path, those things just pop out. Okay, so Euthyphro, that's the first one. Okay, so you walk into the park, boom, there he is in his car. He stops, he gets out, there's his afro, Euthyphro. Oh, yeah, right. I remember what he's talking about, right? So placing them in a consistent place, number one, makes it a little easier to tie together common things. So if you have a small town and you have lived there your whole life, you might have one section for idioms and one area for verbs, one area for nouns, one area for parts of speech, and you mentally visit different areas of that town and you just walk along in different areas in your mind and uncover the things that you have learned there. It's sort of like placing physical objects there, except you're doing it in your mind, in your imagination. And it is really powerful. It takes work. The thing is, it takes work to do it up front, right? But once you've done the work, once you've placed it there, then it's just kind of automatic. Whenever you go back to that, it just pops up. It's automatically there. And it's really great. It takes practice. It takes work. But I find it to be a great memory technique. If you want to try it out with specific things related to English or anything else you're learning, I'd love to hear how it works for you. If you have any questions about it, let me know. Again, this is just my sort of way of remembering things. It may not work for you, but give it a try. Try summarizing, asking questions, making associations, and then placing those things, those associations, in a specific place in your memory. You don't have to do all of them. You could leave off the place part if you want, but try out parts of this. Let me know how it goes. If you haven't already done so, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. And of course, you can get a free course, a free English course, by checking out the links in the description.